If you are currently leveling up your Django and Postgres skills with this tutorial, you might like to know that this tutorial is part of a whole playlist where you will learn how to, with Django and Postgres, create database level constraints and triggers. If you like this playlist and you would like to learn more about Django ORM, then do check out our Django ORM Mastery course on Udemy. Links to the playlist and course can be found in the video description. Now that we've connected our Django project to a Postgres database, this opens up another world of possibilities. If we look at our models in the inventory app, we can see that when we create our models, for example, we add or we are also including some of the data validation logic, which is going to be performed at the application level by Django. So whenever, for example, we insert data into the category table here, we can see that there is a max length of 120. It's meant to be a unique field. It cannot be default. So all of these different validation logic aspects can be performed at the application level. So when designing and developing a database-driven application, which typically describes our Django application, we often have to decide where to place this data validation logic. We've seen here in Django that potentially the database logic is very much at the application level, but we can also add data validation logic at the database level. So each approach has its own advantages and disadvantages, and the choice often depends on specific requirements of your application. Now, I say more often or not, but more often or not, our database in actual fact is serving multiple applications. And you can imagine we have a database table and it has, for example, let's say it has a name field, and that name field has been designated, say, 100, maximum of 100 characters. This is just an example. Okay, so we have our Django application here, Django application here, and that has some sort of application logic which prevents, when we try to insert data into a database, it uses that application logic to prevent any name from being sent across to our database and inserted if the name is more than, say, 100 characters. Now, there may be occasions where other applications, maybe they've forgotten or the application logic has changed slightly, isn't tested efficiently, and what might happen is that something may slip into our database that doesn't match our validation rules that we want to apply to the data in the database. So there may be a good reason to, in actual fact, instead of adding the logic, our data logic, our validation logic to the applications, it might sometimes be a better idea to actually add the validation logic in the database system, so that for anyone who tries to connect to our database or any application that utilizes our database, they would all have to follow that application logic, which is placed in or on the actual database system. Now, as like always, there's always advantages and disadvantages. So advantages to database level validation might include data integrity, security, and performance, but the disadvantages potentially of using data validation logic on the database might include it becomes a little bit more complex to maintain and debug, and it's not necessarily very flexible because there might be some examples or there might be a need for some applications to follow some rules and some applications to follow other rules. Of course, in that case, we couldn't have a centralized rule, validation rule, because both of those applications would need different rules. That, of course, leads us down to the idea that we can combine both approaches. So in a lot of cases, you might find that there is a hybrid approach that combines both database level and application level validation, which can provide the best, of course, of both worlds. So what we're going to do now is to actually create some database level validation for our project that we are developing. So if we go back now to our diagram, if you want to access this, check out the tutorial at the start of this module. It takes you through the process of accessing this, and you can now manage and change to your heart's content. If you have a look on the right hand side, you can now see that there is, in addition to the data dictionary, there is a constraints and triggers table which identifies the database level constraints or validation checks that we are going to create for every individual table. Now remember, this project is just made up. I'm just making up as we go along, but we're following this approach because it allows us now to really delve a little bit deeper into the migration process and the migration file. So we're going to become a little bit more familiar with that, and it's going to allow us to add some custom SQL, which is then going to set up our constraints and triggers for individual tables.